Okay, so last week we finished up with Elihu talking. Not Elihu. Elihu's going to be talking for a little while yet in our lessons here, but we finished up with chapter 33. And I guess I don't know exactly why the scripture at that point, in verse 4 or verse 1 of chapter 34, it says, "Then Elihu continued and said." So I don't know if that's like saying that he took a break for a moment and nobody spoke up, so he kept going, or if it just is the author's way of saying, then he kept going. So I don't know which way it is there, but either way, we have a chapter break, and it says that he continued talking. But as you remember, if you remember, basically Elihu comes in and he's kind of angry with the way things have been, with what's been being said. He's not happy with Job because Job's attacking God, and he's not happy with Job's critics because they didn't do a good job of contradicting what Job had to say, and they didn't convince him, and he doesn't agree with what they had to say either. So do you remember what the big difference between what Elihu thinks suffering, or what suffering is, versus what Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar thought? What the key difference is? What is that? That didn't sound like a cricket.
They really didn't try to console Job as much as they did tell him about everything that he did wrong.
Right. Yep. And what is it that they think? Why do they think Job's suffering? Why did they think that? It was because they thought that he had sinned, right? And so God was punishing him. Like the worse you were, the more you got punished. And we debunked that as far as why that didn't work. Actually, Job debunked it pretty well as far as that goes. So what does Elihu think? Why does Elihu think Job's being punished? Or suffering, I should say. He doesn't necessarily think he's being punished, but suffering. In the last chapter, he was indicating that God uses suffering not as punishment so much as a chastening rod, directing in the right way. We talked about that. Is that true? That one's pretty rough. Yeah. So it's true from a certain point of view. Like we talked about how people can sin and have a lot of pleasure out of that sin, and not receive negative consequences. At the same time, there are sins that can have negative consequences. So and there are certain things that can be considered that way. So you can kind of not necessarily. I don't necessarily think it's to the extent that Elihu's talking about it, that suffering is because God's trying to guide us in the right way. We know that. We'll talk more about that as we go here as well. But at the same time, you might say, is it a better view than what Job's critics had?
No.
So, no?
Absolutely not.
And why not?
That's all I gotta say is no. Because if God beats you down to the point where you want to die and are begging to die, I don't see that as correct.
Right. So there again, as applied to this situation, definitely not at all, right? He wasn't anywhere close to being correct in the application to this. As far as actual reality, maybe a little closer to what, there are God does try to guide us in the right way, and we talked about that a little bit, about scriptures that talk about how the discipline from God as compared to what they were saying, which is totally Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were totally off track. So I would say he's a little bit closer, but definitely not better by any stretch, as far as, or not a lot better in what he's saying. Plus, we talked about how he's accusing Job of being prideful, and then what's one of the things that he says right off the bat? Like, these words are from God, even though not so much. So he's got some problems of his own as well. So anyway, that's where we're at. He's kind of stated, and he will continue to restate what he thinks of the conversation that happened before, and then what he can kind of give his opinion. So we're ready for chapter 34. If you guys want to read, one of you wants to read verses 1 through 4. Oh, before you do that, actually, I'll give you a little bit more. Here in this chapter, he is continuing to dispute those assumptions, like I said, but he also is defending God's justice and encouraging Job to look to God in faith, which isn't bad to say that, but
the circumstance is pretty terrible.
Right.
God's just. That's why he's pounding you into the ground.
Yeah, once again, all these people in their conversation don't seem to really get the circumstance. Like, there's no filter on it as far as what's going on here. No comforting, I guess you would say. It's all about proving that what they think is right. And that's kind of the big problem here. All right, so let's go 1 through 4 here.
Then Elihu said, "Hear my words, you wise men. Listen to me, you men of learning. For the ear tests words, and the tongue tastes food. Let us discern ourselves what is right. Let us learn together what is good."
All right, so here again, Elihu pleads for Job and his critics to listen to what he has to say. And to paraphrase it, I would say he basically is saying, just like you can tell whether you like the food you taste, you should be able to listen to something and determine if it makes sense. Is that always the case?
No, the whole point of him saying, we can discern what is good. No, what that means is I get to decide what I think is good, whether it really is or not by God's standard. So there's a lot of things I might like.
So you're thinking that Elihu's not taking God into consideration here in what he's saying?
I think he's taking God into consideration in so much as God agrees with him.
Now, I don't know if I have that negative of a view of what Elihu's saying. I'm not sure I go down that far, but I get what you're saying as far as that. Yeah.
He's speaking on God's behalf. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So, and I also don't think that it's always true that you can tell whether something makes sense or not. I mean, like, if you don't have the basis to go from and somebody talks, like, in Proverbs it talks about how one person appears to be right until you hear the second person. So I don't know that that's always true, that you can hear something and say, well, this makes sense or it doesn't. Like, you kind of got to do some investigation, right, in order to figure that out. Yeah, you got to make sure that you have it.
Sometimes I just let it the way it is, because...
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it doesn't matter. But if it does matter, then we need to go figure it out. We need to make sure that we do our own investigation and that we have the knowledge to make that decision, I would say. So I don't think that's always the case, that you can just listen to something and tell whether it makes sense or not. All right, so let's go 5 through 15 then.
Job says, "I am innocent, but God denies me justice. Although I am right, I am considered a liar. Although I am guiltless, his arrows inflict an incurable wound. Is there anyone like Job who drinks scorn like water? He keeps company with the evildoers. He associates with the wicked. For he says, there is no profit in trying to please God. So listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do evil, from the Almighty to do wrong. He repays everyone for what they have done. He brings them on he brings on them what their conduct deserves. It is unthinkable that God would do wrong, that the Almighty would pervert justice. Who appointed him over the earth? Who put him in charge of the whole world? If it were his intention, and he withdrew his spirit and breath, all humanity would perish together, and mankind would return to the dust.
Okay, so Elihu again proclaims what he believes, what he believes Job has been saying about the situation. And he says that Job had claimed he was righteous and that God was unfairly harming him and that God had taken away his right. Now, have you ever had anybody repeat your words back to you in a conversation at any time?
Like we didn't know what we just said.
Well, and whenever that happens, what sometimes happens, or what do you think whenever somebody repeats back what you said? A couple of different things can happen.
We tend to take it out of context and twist it to fit their narrative.
Okay, so sometimes they might be taking it out of context and fitting what they want. Sometimes maybe we realize that we shouldn't have said what we said. Like, oh yeah, I didn't mean to say that way, or something like that. So there's a couple of different things that can happen whenever that, but here he's just restating, and I think it's almost word for word what Job had said. And I wonder what Job is thinking at this point, if he's like, ooh, did I mean to say that? Or if he's like, no, wait a second, you're taking me out of context, like what Charles said, or which way he's going. He might be like, ooh, I didn't mean to say that exactly that way. Maybe, because he's angry at God and he's saying these things. And then whenever it's repeated to him, it might be, like whenever, might be more like whenever you talk into your kids and you say, do you realize what you just said? Whenever they're mad at you and they're letting you have it or something. Any parents ever have that experience? No? Okay, so anyway, yeah, I remember, I think it was my mom that always used to tell me, I wish I had a tape recorder, and I've said this to my kids. This is when you know you're in trouble, when you start repeating what your parents say to you, right? I wish I had a tape recorder so I could play back what you just said. that kind of a thing. So anyway, that's what's happening to Job here. He's getting told what he had just said. And Elihu is shocked by the accusation against God and says that Job has drunk derision like water and therefore is in the company of the wicked. Job had indicated that it didn't do a person any good to try to please God. And Elihu does not like that at all. So Elihu defends God and says that he cannot do wickedness. He emphasizes that God didn't receive his authority from anyone. Where did he get his authority from? And that he could, and basically that God could do away with the world at any point if he wanted to. So he's just basically indicating that like saying, these are the things that Job has said that I have a strong disagreement with, and this is why. Anybody have any comments on that? I don't have any specific questions on that part before we go on.
I've done that myself. I've said something before I thought about what I was going to say.
Said something before you thought,
I didn't think, I just said it.
Yeah, and that's what we talked about at first when we started talking about Elihu. Part of the part that's bad about what Elihu is doing is that he's out of anger. And so there's no filter on it. It's just, wow, I didn't realize it was going to get cloudy that quickly. But anyway, so yeah, he's just spouting off to some degree.
Is he talking out of anger, Elihu?
I think, yeah, he's pretty angry.
Is he pretty angry?
Yeah, that's what the indication
Not
is
so
anyway.
much Job as he is as
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible for me, nobody can gauge exactly, but it says that if you go back to 32, it says, against Job, his anger burned because he justified himself before God. So he's definitely angry as to how that's manifesting itself and what his personality is and all that. I mean, it's impossible to know that, but he's...
Wouldn't he have calmed down before he started to speak?
No.
Nope.
Not a chance.
Doesn't appear so in this case that's what's happening. So he's speaking out of anger. Once again, what that means is that part of what he has to say is good and accurate, but you got two problems. Some of what he's saying is still from a wrong viewpoint, not understanding the situation, and because it's out of anger, it's being said in a way that's not helpful in many cases. And we talked about that. You know, we got to be careful about what we say may be right, but if you say it at the wrong time or in the wrong way, it doesn't do any good.
Well, there's something else in here that really kind of
Irks you?
Yeah, there's a nice word. It irks me just a bit. As he's looking and saying, you know, God is just. I'm not disagreeing. But that God will repay you right away for whatever you're doing so that everyone's getting what they deserve.
Well, I don't think that he's saying right away, because there's actually,
Well, verse 12, is it unthinkable that God would do wrong, that the Almighty would revert justice? He's
Right.
referring to Job, so therefore, what's happening to you must be God's justice on you.
Right, but later on there is a scripture that he talks about where it may not, almost where he says it may not be in the time that you want it to be. So there is, I don't know how exactly you interpret that with this verse.
Justice ever come to a wrongdoer when they want it to.
Right. Well, or unjust, or the other way around. When does justice come? And that's what he's saying is you may not get it in the time that you're wanting it to happen. But yeah, he is saying, yeah, well, like you were saying, here in this situation, the same as the other three did, he's applying to Job what he's saying, and it doesn't necessarily fit with the scenario that's going down. Because he's basically saying, well, if you go back to the discipline, he's still indicating that Job did something wrong.
Right.
Like he's saying, but the punishment's not because you were evil, it's to correct you into the right way. So it's still wrong. It's still off base.
Not letting him off the hook.
No. Yeah, he's not saying, oh, I don't think this is because you did nothing wrong, Job. I think you did do something wrong. But God's using this to send you in the right direction. So it's a little bit of a different take on it, but still not accurate as far as that goes. So yeah, but yeah, to tell somebody, well, God's always just in the middle of them being in a painful situation, not real helpful as far as that goes. So that's kind of where he's at with this. All right, you guys ready? Let's do 16 through 20 then.
If you have understanding, hear this. Listen to what I say. Can someone who hates justice govern? Will you condemn the just and mighty one? Is he not the one who says to the kings, you are worthless? To the nobles, you are wicked? Who shows you partiality to the princes? It does not favor the rich over the poor, for they all their work his hands. They die in an instant, in the middle of the night. The people are shaken, and they pass away. The mighty are removed without the human head.
All right, so this goes back to what Charles was focused in on there, God's justice. Elihu addresses Job specifically and defends God's justice. He asks how God could govern if he is unjust. Well,
And yet, injustices occur all the time.
and on top of that, who controls whether God's just or not just? We don't.
Yeah.
That's only God that controls that, right? So the argument doesn't really make sense because, well, yeah, God could govern if he's unjust, if he wanted to, at least in my opinion. Now then that would be a big problem for us, but he could do it. But he then says that God doesn't show partiality. He says, what happens to kings, to noblemen, to rich people? Same thing happens. It's kind of like going back to Ecclesiastes, Solomon, like everybody ends up at the same place, right? We're all headed to the same place.
Yeah, but isn't that a tragic analysis for him? It's like, so God's going to treat us all the same. We're all going to die. But you, Job, you deserve this special punishment, whereas all the other evildoers in the world get to live really well.
Yeah. You know, like I said, he obviously has not reasoned through everything that he's arguing here, just like the others hadn't. What they're saying, because what they had said, if you applied it to Job and you applied it, it would apply to everybody, so everybody would be in the same situation.
We'd all be hurt.
Yeah. And then the same thing here, if it applies to Job, it applies to everyone. Of course, the big assumption here that everybody's making, including apparently Elihu, I would assume, is that Job's done something terribly bad. That's the underlying assumption in this whole thing. And we've talked about that. When you make an assumption like that, and you don't have the facts, it's going to cause problems. Like, nothing good could come of that. All right, let's do 21 through 37 then. Looks like Dave got the bigger scripture reading this time.
His eyes are always on, his eyes are on the ways of the mortals. He sees their every step. There is no deep shadow, no utter darkness where evildoers can hide. God has no need to examine people further, that they should come before him for judgment. Without inquiry, he shatters the mighty and sets up the others in their place. Because he takes note of their deeds, he overthrows them in the night, and they are crushed. He punishes them for their wickedness, where everyone can see them, because they have turned to follow him, and no regard for any of his ways. They cause the cry of the poor to come before him, so that he heard the cry of the needy. But if he remains silent, who can condemn him? If he hides his face, who can see him? Yet he is over individual and nation alike, to keep the godless from ruling, from laying snares for the people. Suppose someone says to God, I am guilty, but will offer no more, will offend no more. Teach me what I cannot see. If I have done wrong, I will not do so again. Should God then reward you on your terms? When you refuse to repent, you must decide, not I, so tell me what you know. Men of understanding declare, wise men who hear me say to me, Job speaks without knowledge, his words lack insight. Oh, that Job might be tested to the utmost for answering like a wicked man. To his sin he adds rebellion. Scornfully he clasps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God.
All right, so actually, Terry, going back to your question there, with what he's saying to Job there at the end, and then also if you go back to where he was kind of sarcastically going after, I'd say that's kind of, to me, that seems like that's out of anger and being kind of snarky, you might say, to him. But Elihu says that God is both all-seeing and just, and that there's no need of an investigation for God to properly judge people. That's very true, right? God doesn't need anybody to investigate what's happening. He sees everything. And he asks if it's right for Job to expect God to recompense him on the terms that Job wants. And he actually believes that Job should be punished more because he's being rebellious and prideful in his response and talking at God too much. So here's a question. Is it wrong to question God when you're suffering?
No.
We've talked about that a lot, right? Yeah, there's nothing wrong with questioning God. Here's the kicker. What type of an attitude should you have when you're questioning God? If you're looking to go against God, that could lead to some pretty major issues, right? The questioning should be legitimate questioning out of why is this happening to me, or whatever whatever it's leading you to, it's got to be done with the right attitude. What could happen if we don't question, or if we question God and we don't have a humble attitude or a contrite attitude?
Well, not just that, but our entire view at that point is skewered. We couldn't see, the old expression, you can't see through the trees, you can't see forest through the trees. If we're not coming in properly, we're going to smack the trees.
Yep. I mean, this is a perfect illustration of that. Like, everybody is coming at this from the wrong direction. Nobody understands what's actually happening. They don't have a good view. They definitely don't have the big picture. They've got this little part of the big picture, and everybody's making all of these judgments and decisions based off of that. What's that?
And assumptions.
Big assumptions, yep. So with that, that's what's causing problems. So if we go in with the wrong kind of attitude, we're not going to get the right answer. I don't think we're not going to come to the right conclusion, and we can build up animosity, and that's why I think whenever I've seen when Christians run into tough times, you see some of them fall away and give up on God, and because why? Because they're angry at God for what's happened, and they don't have the right attitude as that happens. We've talked about that. That's not easy. It's easier said than it is to actually go through it, right? It's easier to say we should have strong faith when we're coming up on these situations before you go through it. But that doesn't change the fact that it's important for us to try to build that faith and to try to have that strength in God when times are good. I think it's extremely important. So what's something that Elihu is pointing out in relation to Job, and ironically, I would say about himself as well, that we can learn in what Elihu's saying here about Job? What's he say here at the end? He's talking about how he adds rebellion to his sin, he claps his hands among us, and multiplies his words against God. We've already talked about it today, too. Sometimes it's better to not say too much, right? When you're angry would be a time, and also just when you're going through a tough time, when you are distraught. Think about how it sounds if someone's complaining about something bad that's happened to them. Like whenever you hear somebody talking to you, somebody's complaining about something. What is that? How do you think about that? I think it depends on what they're complaining about, right?
A lot of times people bring this stuff on themselves.
Yeah.
Because they don't listen, they don't understand, they don't look to God for guidance, they just don't. People bring a lot of stuff on themselves.
We do. We bring a lot of stuff on ourselves. But here, going back to what we were talking about as far as that goes, in the middle of somebody suffering may not be the time to point that out. As far as, hey, look at what you did back here that caused that, right? That may not be the right time to do that, but they do. But when somebody's complaining, that may be something that may be what you're thinking is, well, you brought that on yourself.
But at the same time, we should be trying to help them, not.
Right. We need to encourage them
to feel they already are.
To look to the God, or to turn to the right thing.
We need to encourage them.
Well, sometimes, here we go, out in left field again.
Go ahead.
When people are hurting, it's not, in my opinion, I guess, I'm not an expert on it, but there's a lot of venting that goes on. And venting from people who are hurting is kind of cathartic in several ways. One, it helps them get through all their emotions and all their thoughts. It gives them a chance to voice it, think on it even while they're saying it. And it certainly relieves a lot of personal tension. So sometimes I think maybe we ought to let people vent when they need to vent.
And I'm trying to remember if that's in my lesson coming up or if it's in a lesson I did before, but what we talked about a little bit when we vent, because we do have to vent sometimes, we need to be careful who we vent to. Because there's a couple things that can happen. One, we want to be a good example. Even when we're going through suffering and pain, we want to be a good example to those around us. So who you vent to, you don't want to vent to somebody and say something you shouldn't to people who you're trying to be an example to. It needs to be, when you're venting, you need to try to vent to somebody who you trust, somebody who's strong and faithful, and those kind of things. And I totally agree. Sometimes venting. Now, what I was referring to as far as somebody complaining, you got two different kinds: complaining legitimately about a bad situation, or what do we tend to do on a daily basis, or at least I do. We complain about things that don't matter. It's not something that we, I think I've mentioned this before, if I had a bad baseball game, I'd be like, boy, that was just horrible. God, what are you doing? What difference does a baseball game make in life, So, not saying that baseball is not important, DP. But really, on the grand scheme of things, that's not a really big deal. So, we want to try not to be whiners and complain about everything. But at the same time, when you're going through something struggle, yeah, I think venting you got to do something. You can't just go through it without talking about it. That's going to lots of times make it worse. But I think we need to be careful about the example we're setting, and especially in who we talk to when we're in that situation. Christians need to speak the truth even when we are suffering, and it may be best to keep silent at times when we don't understand, except for maybe, like you said, to find somebody or something. But it may not be good to get out in front of everybody and scream out on Facebook or something, Sounds like, just don't ever do Facebook. I'm pretty much with you there. We can be, in the dark, and we can have difficulty remembering how good God is to us and what He's done for us when we're suffering and when we're going through those tough times. So we need to try to control our tongue and show spiritual and emotional maturity during those times if we can. And I do have one more for DP to read here. If you want to flip over to James chapter 3. James chapter 3, verses 2 through 12. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to tell you guys about this one. So if you want to read that, DP, James 3, 2 through 12. I think this will sound pretty familiar once DP starts reading it.
Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that who teaches will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, to be able to keep the whole body in check. When we put bits in their mouth of horses and make them obey us, who could turn the whole animal? Or take ships as an example. Although they are large and driven by strong winds, they are steered by very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, and it makes great boasts. Consider what great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue is also a fire. The world of evil among parts of the body, it contemns the whole body and sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and itself on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, sea creatures are being tamed, and they have been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. When the tongue is My tongue we praise our Lord our Father. With it we curse human beings who have been made by God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Both fresh water and salt water flow from the same. Can fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water.
All right, so James says, if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. That's, think about it. Where do you have the most trouble? Are you able, some people have struggles with different things, right? But what he's saying is everybody struggles with saying things that they shouldn't say, right? Like some of us may have problems with eating too much or drinking the wrong thing or any number of things that we do that physically or, that we shouldn't. But everybody says things they don't mean to say. And if you can control that, what does he mean when he says you're perfect?
Control the tongue, you control anything.
Right, and then he goes through a bunch of examples of just this little, how something little can cause, so much, well, a little spark can start a fire. We sing a song about that, it only takes a spark to get a fire going, right? What's that? I love that. Yeah, one of DP's favorites. And then, ships with the little rudder and horses with the bit. So our tongue can get us into a world of hurt. And if we're ever able to totally, every day I think we all go through and we're like, boy, I wish I had said this, or I wish I hadn't said that, or whatever, those kind of things. And here's my next sentence. So you were right on. It was this lesson that I was studying for whenever I said, of course, sometimes we just need to vent. So there you go. It was this lesson. So I think we need to be careful about who we vent to, how much we allow ourselves to say. But we sometimes we do need to do that. We also need to consider, I think you brought this up before, Charles, as well, about sometimes you just got to give the situation over to God. When we don't understand it and we can't figure it out why this is happening and we don't like it, it's not something we want to be going through, we just got to turn it over to God at that point, because you may not be able to get the answer that you're looking for or be able to figure it out. So I think that's also important to remember. But I think our goal should be to try to, as like what James is saying, and what Elihu was saying, is to be aware of sometimes more words don't make it better. Like I said, what's ironic about that is he's also in the same boat. More words are not making it better, at least at this point. I think Elihu does get a little better as he goes on as far as what he has to say, I think. But so I think that's important. All right, so we're about out of time here, and we got one chapter in, so we'll pick up with 35 next week.